at end 2019 on the eve of the COVID pandemic. So a significant jump in inflation. Second way in which macroeconomic imbalances are presenting themselves are acute debt pressures. The level of public indebtedness across the world has gone up, markedly so in recent years. This reflects a range of factors, including relatively easy financing conditions globally, which, at least for a while, facilitated higher safe debt levels. Second, the adverse balance sheet effects of major global shocks, notably the COVID pandemic, which particularly in Africa has had a marked impact on economic and developmental outcomes. And then the third factor behind acute debt pressures, of course, is the large development spending that has been undertaken by many of our countries. The third way in which macroeconomic imbalances are presenting themselves at the moment across the world is through constrained financing. A corollary to mounting debt pressures, and indeed a factor that has contributed to these pressures, is the marked increase in the cost of financing facing most developing countries in particular. This is a much overlooked point often. Take Uganda. Through 2005 or so, official development assistance, a non-trivial share of which was channeled through the budget, was in the range of 12 to 14% of GNI each year. This contrasts with just 6% of GNI between 2015 and 2019. The effect of this has been to raise the weighted average cost of financing facing most developing countries. As countries have not filled this gap via revenue mobilization as much as they have via expensive market financing, both domestically and externally. And at the current conjuncture, access to even such market financing, particularly from abroad, has of course become more tenuous. The fourth and last way in which macroeconomic imbalances are presenting themselves in our countries is, of course, the pressure on exchange rates. As major central banks have tightened monetary policy aggressively to contain inflation, it has pulled capital out of most developing countries. The result, not surprisingly, has been strong pressure on exchange rates and foreign exchange reserves as countries have tried to resist the pressure. I should also add here that it is not just economic headwinds that emerging and developing countries are facing, but also geopolitical tensions, which are beginning to hamper closer global integration. Specifically, geopolitical fragmentation, an ongoing phenomena amplified, though not generated by the war in Ukraine, has started to disrupt trade and investment flows, dislocating global value chains and raising production costs. Globalization over the last several decades has been a powerful phenomenon that has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and impacted our African people beneficially. If, as it's threatening to, globalization goes into reverse, it will compound our current economic difficulties. The last time we had a constellation of this kind of economic and geopolitical headwinds facing developing countries was probably the 1980s and early 1990s. When I recently mentioned this to a colleague, she mentioned that I was overlooking the global financial crisis of 2008-9. But I think the effects of that crisis were much more limited in most African countries because of the region's then limited integration into global markets. More important, countries' debt levels were manageable, so many countries were able to pursue supportive counter-cyclical policies to limit a sharp slowdown. Not so this time. There are many, many reasons why we all miss the late Governor Tumusimi Mutebire. One of them for me is because I would so much like to have heard his thoughts on how best to navigate the current rather difficult domestic and external economic landscape. One source of consolation for me, at least, is watching Governor Mutabile's much beloved Bank of Uganda, sustain his legacy of responding adroitly to these emerging macroeconomic pressures, led by Deputy Governor Michael Atingiego and his staff. Thank you for sustaining his legacy. I think it's for this reason that the spike in inflation here, for example, has been limited to around 10%, roughly about the same as we saw in many advanced countries, much lower than what the levels of inflation we were observing in the vast majority of developing countries with flexible exchange rates. Let me now shift to the second substantive part of my presentation, which is to try and present some of the stylized facts of Uganda's development progress over the last 40 or so years. For this next bit of my intervention, I want to ask you to cast your mind back to 1990, right around the end of the Cold War, and about the time when conflict here in Uganda had attenuated markedly and the government was embarking on a new approach to economic policy formulation. To my mind, policymakers at that time, and indeed elsewhere in the region, to be frank, faced three major challenges. The first one was getting economic growth started. The second challenge was sustaining this growth for as long as possible. And then the third one was engendering structural transformation. How has Uganda fared on these three dimensions? Getting growth started was the first task and was achieved relatively quickly here in Uganda. Policymakers moved aggressively to limit macroeconomic imbalances. High inflation was recognized for the awful distortionary tax it is on the poor in particular. And an important contributor to a high inflation, had been excessive monetary financing. This was addressed by better aligning public spending with available financing, thus better limiting fiscal deficits. Consequently, inflation decelerated quite rapidly. Annual inflation, for example, in 1988-89 averaged 149% a year, but had been reduced to around 6% a decade later. As important as the initial step to contain macroeconomic imbalances, though, were the policy frameworks and institutions that the late governor was instrumental in helping put in place to ensure that imbalances remained contained on a sustained basis. These have been touched upon already. I will skip and highlight the few that I think were particularly important. I think perhaps the first of these was when he was still at Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. He helped introduce what was called the Medium-Term Expenditure Framework. This helped set out the envelope for spending in the current and forthcoming budgets and made transparent the trade-offs that were being made between spending categories and helped set expectations for ministries in future budgets. A related and important initiative, I think, was contributing to the creation of the Uganda Revenue Authority, in which I understand he was instrumental. Second, once he moved to the Bank of Uganda, he was relentless in ensuring that the Bank of Uganda kept inflation in check. Initially, this was via more of a rules-based approach, setting annual targets for monetary growth. But as the link between monetary growth and inflation outcomes became tenuous as the economy evolved, he pushed for the adoption of an inflation targeting light approach. This new approach called for more room for discretion and use of interest rates to influence inflation and output. I have to tell you that there's been much discussed today about how the governor's views were aligned with the IMF on many occasions, but this was one occasion on which there was huge disagreement between IMF staff and the governor. We were skeptical about the feasibility of such an approach in a developing country. But he robustly pressed on for the policy shift and, of course, proved us all wrong. Forgive me if these innovations sound rather technical and boring, but I can assure you that they were the basis through which macroeconomic stability was assured, and it was on this foundation that growth was to be sustained for several decades here in Uganda. The second challenge that I mentioned earlier, that of sustaining sufficiently high growth, I think I've given the cat away by saying that this is a feat that Uganda has achieved rather well over the years. Between 1992 and 2001, Uganda's real GDP growth averaged around 7% per year. It was almost double the median sub-Saharan African or EAC average growth rate. Uganda's growth rates in those years was impressive, even compared with the Asian success stories of the likes of Vietnam and India. To be sure, growth has slowed a bit over the past decade, with Uganda falling behind its Asian peers in particular, but it still continued to outperform the median sub-Saharan African country. That said, high population growth over the same period has meant that the gains were less rapid in per capita terms, especially between 1992 and 2011, whereas per capita income increased threefold in Vietnam, it increased just twofold in Uganda. Still, I do not want to diminish Uganda's achievement. Such uninterrupted growth for a landlocked country with the security challenges and associated spillovers that have prevailed in the region is a truly commendable feat. Of course, macroeconomic stability and economic expansion in and of themselves are not what reforms were all about. These things matter because of the contribution they make to improving living standards. And in this regard, particularly through 2015 or so, Uganda has made commendable progress in reducing poverty and improving fundamental development indicators such as increased life expectancy, reduced infant mortality, and many other indicators. Moving on to the third dimension, or third challenge that the late governor and his colleagues faced in the early 90s. This is, of course, is how well Uganda has fared in engendering structural transformation. Structural transformation is the process whereby an economy transforms from being largely a primary commodity-based economy to one where industry and services dominate economic activity. But not just that, it's about overall increase in productivity in the economy from the agriculture to all other economic sectors. Such economic transformation is the kernel of economic development and poverty reduction. The picture on this front in Uganda is, however, very mixed. Through around 2011, there was significant progress in this dimension, but this has lost steam and even reversed in some cases since then. Let me cite a few numbers, if I may. The share of industrial activity increased from 10% in 1990 to 27% in 2021 in Uganda. But most of this increase took place in the first two decades of this period. While the pace of transformation has been much higher than in the median sub-Saharan Africa country or even in the EAC region, the current level of industrialization is not much different from regional peers because Uganda started from a lower base. Similarly, the share of services has increased from around 30% of GDP to around 42% between 1990 and 2021. In the past decade, however, there has even been a bit of a reversal in this share. Currently, the share of services is lower than the median country in sub-Saharan Africa. The transformation of the economy has also been reflected in greater integration of the Ugandan economy with the rest of the world. Export volumes have grown fourfold between 2000 and 2020. At the same time, again, a large compositional shift in export baskets towards manufacturing occurred earlier in this period rather than in the latter part of this period. So what accounts for this initial rapid progress and subsequent stalling of economic transformation in Uganda? To my mind, there are three factors at work. For one, some of it no doubt has to do with the generally observed phenomena in the process of long-run development across countries, whereby growth and transformation tend to be faster in the initial stages of development and mature to a more moderate pace as per capita income increases. Second, I would venture, though, to add that there are other contributing elements, notably from the external front. The global environment was generally more supportive for frontier market countries like Uganda in the 1990s and 2000s, as China's rapid growth and integration into the international economy generated favorable spillovers. Not so in the last 5-6 years. Finally, my strong sense is also that the overarching approach to policymaking here in Uganda, very much characterized, as Adam Smith put it, by peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, has proved to not be sufficient for engendering structural transformation, at least not rapidly so. Instead, a much more deliberate, sustained, and focused approach is needed, and that has not been much evident of late. Against this backdrop, what policy priorities might the late Governor Tumusimi Mutebire have settled on to reinvigorate structural transformation? Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, I think he would have called for much more aggressive domestic revenue mobilization. Let me make the case for this as I think he would have very directly. For one, the government has much spending and investment that it needs to undertake, and alternative financing sources to revenue mobilization are scant. Second, Uganda is doing rather poorly in terms of revenue collections relative to its peers and the amount of debt that needs to be serviced. As a share of GDP, tax revenue collections remains below 15%, much lower than the EAC average, much less what is observed in many other developing countries. And this shortcoming becomes even more obvious when we compare the ratio of interest payments to tax revenues. In Uganda, it currently stands at 20%, compared to 11% on average in the EAC and 9% on average in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. When you compare the level of debt in Uganda with other countries, it does not stand out because public debt as a ratio to GDP stands at around 50%, well below the 64% SSA average. But in terms of debt servicing capacity, Uganda is clearly not doing so well. It is for this reason that I strongly believe that the late governor would have focused on revenue mobilization like a laser beam as a priority challenge. This is not something that requires just technical solutions like improving tax administration, narrowing tax exemptions, expanding the tax base, but also quite a lot of political will. One of the most impressive things about being an occasional traveler here to Kampala is just how much the skyline, infrastructure, and the nature of business activities continue to transform remarkably between visits. It is very, very clear that, facilitated by the strong investment, public investment in infrastructure in particular, that the government has been making, businesses are making quite a lot of money. And rightly so, of course. But the government, I don't think, is getting its fair share in capturing the rate of return through taxes on all of the investments it has been making over the years. I know that one concern is that more revenue collection will deter robust business activity. But as I noted above, the level of taxation here is much below the threshold where higher tax collection could disincentivize investments. Besides, if spending is not going to have to be squeezed further, or the fiscal deficit to widen and cause debt problems, there really is no alternative to further increasing tax collections. The second priority that the late governor, I think, would have identified to engender structural transformation, I think, is the importance of further human capital investment for climbing up the value-added ladder. In Uganda, both secondary and tertiary enrollment have been lower than in the sub-Saharan African average, and well below the level, of course, of many lower middle-income Asian countries. Also, in the context of recent school closures during the pandemic, learning losses have been significant, and the risk that children will not return to education have increased. I think focusing on this area is particularly important now as Uganda begins to experience a rising demographic dividend, with the working age share of population set to increase in the coming decades. Fully reaping the benefits of this dividend will require investing in skills of the working age population to enhance their employment prospects. The third policy priority is financial sector development. I know from conversations that I have had with the late Governor Tumusimi Mutebire that limited progress in financial deepening was a source of deep disappointment. The most telling number in this regard, I think, is the rather low level of credit to the private sector as a share of GDP. In the average sub-Saharan African country, this stands at about 40%. In Uganda, 14% of GDP. Just 1/3 of the sub-Saharan African average. Why does this matter, and why has financial deepening disappointed? It matters because the process of structural transformation requires the movement of labor and capital from one part of the economy to another. And this, in turn, requires new investment by firms and economic agents. Often, in the early stages of development, this tends to be financed through retained earnings and profits. This, of course, constrains the amount of resources at their disposal. But it is with access to bank lending and financial market that the scope for investment increases. When these markets malfunction, the process of moving investment to higher productive activities also suffers. As to why financial deepening has disappointed here, to my mind, there are two reasons that dominate. First, the reform agenda in this area never really went much beyond liberalizing interest rates and privatizing public banks. There could and should be much more aggressive follow-up of identifying the binding constraints on credit intermediation and addressing them, as tends to be the case in many other countries. One argument that I have heard to explain the dearth of lending to the private sector here in Uganda is that the cost of borrowing is very high. But as I once heard the late governor refute this point, he pointed out that there are many other countries where the cost of credit is as high, even higher, but banks undertake much more lending. The second reason, and I think the more dominant reason why financial markets have not deepened, is that financial markets do not work in isolation. Perhaps more so than any other business activity, the financial sector requires a transparent and effective judiciary for contract enforcement, robust bank supervisory and regulatory frameworks, and active weeding out of ineffective and weakly capitalized entities. Gone are the days when informal and personal relations could facilitate this. Rather, in this environment, what is needed are robust mechanisms and institutions that can reassure economic agents to transact with each other, knowing well that people that transgress will be penalized. Again, these issues, while partly technical, given the vested interests that stand to be affected, is something that requires a whole of government approach and political will to enforce. Let me now wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. First, I want to try and summarize, rather ambitiously perhaps, what I consider to be the late governor's overall approach to policy making. I think this was a deep appreciation for human fallibility. I think this is why, throughout his distinguished career, he championed the need for institutions that promote excellence and good governance, frameworks that set the limits and require trade-offs, and the need to pay heed to market signals. I think this is an approach that is still very much applicable today. On my occasional visits here, I have sensed deep frustration in government circles that development is not progressing rapidly enough and something radical must be done. This frustration is one I share because the potential of this country is second to none. But as I hope I've been able to persuade you, what is needed here is a focus on a few key areas, notably revenue mobilization to promote resilience, further investment in health and education, and financial sector deepening. You have here an economy that has been able to continue expanding for a remarkably long time, reduce poverty considerably. So it's important to not jeopardize this. What is needed now, I think, is upgrading the capacity of the state to engender more rapid structural transformation. Mr. President, not unlike computers, I think the modern economy requires continuous software upgrades as glitches and vulnerabilities emerge. This requires talented and empowered officials in key policy-making positions to continuously work on identifying and alleviating constraints to growth and investment. Second, I have to, of course, say something about the late governor's persona. He was as brainy as they come as an economist and policymaker, with very strong analytics, whiplash smarts, and always open to powerful counter-arguments. As well, though, he was incredibly courageous. I have previously described him as a lion of a policymaker. This, of course, was in reference to his lifetime of public policy service at Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, Bank of Uganda, and his contributions to the East African community, which have left a large and illustrious imprint on policymaking and policymakers throughout the region, and indeed well beyond. But it was also in reference to his fearlessness, the way he stood his ground when he felt policies detrimental to progress were being considered. He was always ready to speak truth to power. And mind you, he was doing this even in the days as a young man when doing so risked him very real personal harm. I think that there is much our generation of policymakers, advisors, and technocrats could do to emulate him. We have to, of course, recognize that policy positions are often adopted as much for political reasons as they are for solely economic ones. But an important way in which we can all pay homage to the incredible success and legacy of the late Governor Tumusimi Mutebire is by making sure that we compellingly make the case for the appropriate course of action and laying out the consequences of failing to do so. Finally, as the occasion has called for, I have centered my remarks around the late governor, the humble, generous, and often shy person that he was. He would probably have been a bit mortified by the sole focus on him if he was here today with us. I think he would have wanted recognition of his very able fellow collaborators, as mentioned earlier before, like the late Chris Kasami, Keith Muhakanizi, who is not here with us, and many others, including in this crowd. I bow my head to them all, and many others that have so ably served the Ugandan people. And of course, all of this would not have been possible without the oversight of President Museveni. With that, I will end here, and thank you so much for listening to me patiently.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abebe. Another round of applause. As I invite him to take the front seat on my right. Mr. Abebe has talked about a number of things, of course, which we talk about every other day in our boardrooms. But most importantly is, he has said that the economy has been able to continue growing for a remarkably very long time. This deserves another round of applause. And we must note that this has happened because of the good leadership and guidance by His Excellency Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. I now take the honor to invite the first discussant, Dr. Donald Kaberuka. Would you like to use this chair, or if you... Let him stand.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. My association with the late Mutebire goes a long way, about 35 years, in our different capacities. So as I said at his funeral, him and I discussed policies continuously over that period of time. So I want to thank the Bank of Uganda and the family for inviting me to make a few comments on Abebe's excellent remarks. But I have just two problems. One of them is that I agree with everything he has said, so I don't know what to say. The only two differences I have with him is that he's still in office and I'm out of office. So his ability to stray too much out of orthodoxy is circumscribed. He has to stay in line. Since I'm out of office, I have a bit more degrees of freedom to say a few things which I'm sure he agrees with. Another small difference, Abebe, is that international organizations, they have a habit of dividing Africa into two, what they call Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. It's a convenience for the World Bank and the IMF and others, but I don't think I want to approach it from that angle. Because North African countries are part of Africa, although in the IMF and the World Bank, they are counted as part of the Middle East. So this would be my only two differences. You're in office, I'm out of office. And I'll talk about the whole of Africa as you talk about Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I've been given 15 minutes, and I want to respect the time. But before I do so, Mr. President, friends, let me say how lucky we have been to have Abebe leading the IMF Africa Department in the last 5 years of crisis. Under the leadership of Kristalina, the MD, the institution is totally unrecognizable from what was, say, 30 years ago. And I know what I'm talking about. But in addition, since COVID up to now, just listen to these numbers. They used to do $1.5 billion to $2 billion per year. In the last 2 years, they have done $60 billion to Africa. Just note the numbers. So, Abebe, thank you very much for what you have done. The Resilience and Trust Fund, which you have rolled in, is another one. But also, something has happened in the fund which many of you may know. In the past, the fund was very inflexible on many things, very prescriptive. But recently, the fund is very flexible, surprise, surprise. And they have assumed the new missions. Long time ago, it was about macroeconomic stability only, but you heard him talk about structural transformation. They now talk about gender, about climate, about fragile states, and all that is a force for good. So, in responding to these remarks, I thought of doing the following. Mike, Deputy Governor, when he invited me, he said I should answer the question, what would Mutebire have done if he had listened to Abebe's remarks? So, number one, in the 1980s and 90s, Mutebire and his colleagues were instrumental in what are called the first generation of economic reforms. This is inflation, currency misalignment, budget and current account deficit, health of the financial sector, reform of state enterprises, and so on. I'm sure the young generation of Ugandans here may wonder when they hear things like Kibanda exchange rate or Magendo, because they did not live that period. But that is a kind of challenge they are facing. Now, these reforms were not always popular. They did not resolve everything, but they laid a firm foundation for the subsequent trajectory, which Abebe describes very well. I know there have been a lot of criticism about this kind of economic reforms, especially among left-wing circles. One of them was that these reforms, euphemistically called the Washington Consensus, had a lot of ideological baggage in the name of laissez-faire and unabated neoliberalism. I must say that in this room, your humble servant included, in his youthful years, had some sympathy with that view. But he quickly matured out of it. The second critique I had was about design. It tended to be one size fits all. And thirdly, that it undermined ownership of countries to do what they want to do. Now, Abebe, I want to say that there was probably at some point a bit of overcorrection, but quickly corrected in the neoliberal direction. And sometimes the fund had these over-dogmatic approaches, which, thank God, have gone out of the window. The fund is a very fast learning machine, and it has since become an organization you can have a dialogue with, which is not prescribing what you should do, but figuring out what you can do together. So thank you, sir, for that. Now, let me agree with Abebe also that these economic reforms were not an end in themselves. The end was economic transformation, which he describes very well. But here, I want to probably express a heterodox view that in the world of structural transformation, countries can take different paths. Just look around the G20. It could be a neoliberal path, it could be state-led capitalism, or everything in between. Just look at the G20, what is happening there. And then, of course, our countries have matured enough. We know what to do. The external agents of restraint, like in those past years, telling our countries what to do, that is now less and less important. So let me respect my time. What would Mutebire have done? The first thing would be macroeconomic discipline, definitely. Discipline not in the short term, but discipline in the long term. Discipline not because it is good, but because it is existential. It is something which has to happen. And it has to happen in a sustainable way. Because I've had an opportunity to say to some of our ministers that crisis, and there are quite a lot nowadays, will happen all the time. Just look at the crisis we have had over the last 30 years. You can enumerate a whole list of them. From the oil crisis in 1973, the dollar devaluation, 9/11, you can go to global financial crisis, Ebola, COVID, and now, of course, the war in Eastern Europe. So, crises are, so to speak, a new normal. The art of economic policy is about anticipating and building resilience. And that is the situation we're in right now. And I do agree with all the recommendations which the Speaker has made. Now, this issue of consistency over the long term, which was very dear to Mutebire, is very, very important. Nothing can be as damaging as a country going through economic reforms of a decade and a half, and then to throw it away because there is a crisis. It is happening now in a number of African countries, and that means attempt to avoid short-term pain. You actually invite long-term pain and high-cost reforms in the future. Consistency and avoiding volatile policies. Now, rich countries can afford inconsistency. Just look at how they responded to the global financial crisis. Nationalizing banks, printing money because they can. But we don't have that luxury. Our room for maneuver is very, very small. And therefore, consistency over long policies is absolutely critical. And in terms of that consistency, Mr. President, dear friends, I want to say that I think Mutebire would have insisted a lot about anchoring the independence of the central bank. Because all these fights on inflation, in countries where central banks are not independent in law and in fact, this is where hyperinflation, instability of the financial sector becomes a problem. It is absolutely important that our central banks, at this point in time, anchor their independence. But independence does not mean you don't coordinate. It is actually important at this time of crisis that central banks and ministers of finance, even ministries of social affairs, coordinate policies very closely. I'm not saying they should agree always. There should be always some disagreements between the Minister of Finance and the central bank governor. If there isn't, we would be concerned. But there should be close coordination for policy to be meaningful. One thing also I think Mutebire would have insisted upon, as many of his colleagues do, is that when you are anchoring discipline and discipline which imposes short-term pain, that pain must be minimized and applied to all. It cannot simply apply to some. The pain must be minimized, shared, and benefits widely distributed. So, subsidies, let me pick just one. If you're going to have subsidies, and many of our governments are now under pressure to give subsidies on transport, on food, or energy, you have to think. If you give open subsidies available to everyone, so two things will happen. It is the wealthier off who would benefit. The vulnerable people you want to protect actually get less benefits. And number two, they are very expensive. However, a policy of targeted subsidies to those who need it, which are limited in time, is the best way to go. And then you may have also to figure out, is it best to subsidize the food itself or to subsidize agricultural production? I understand our colleagues in Kenya have been having this debate, so Patrick, I look to you to tell us where it has landed, i.e., instead of subsidizing unga, you subsidize maize producers. All these are issues which I think about in terms of equity. One more thing which I think Mutebire would have insisted upon, because we're now living in a world where we're almost getting to a point of the 1930s. And I'm saying this with all the candor at my command, because what I said during the COVID crisis and vaccine access. When wealthy countries, rightly so, were looking after their own people, and we, African countries, even when money was available, could not access the vaccines. You could talk about climate finance, you could talk about how we're dealing with the global recession, supply chain disruptions, the financial markets, and then, of course, this issue of debt. It is important that we make a correct reading of this. Should we continue to be dependent on global supply chains, which can easily become a risk for things which our people need, like medicine, like vaccines, like food now? Or we should take the view that while globalization is a force for good, we're at a point where global supply chains have to also contribute to not producing at the lowest point of production, but at the most reliable point of production. That's the lesson we got from COVID. Now, very finally, just I'll come to the end, 15 minutes, I think. The instrument which IMF has just rolled out, called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund, to help countries cope with climate change, with pandemics, is something marvelous. But it was supposed to be funded by countries reallocating the special drawing rights. Because when the special drawing rights were issued, of course, they went proportionally to the quotas in the fund. So countries who received a large amount of special drawing rights actually don't need them. And so the proposal from the head of the IMF and others was those countries who don't need those special drawing rights can reallocate them under conditions to be discussed to low-income countries via the IMF to help fund pandemics. So thank you for that, but the amounts are still limited to what was available from the limited amount of the special drawing rights. Now, I don't think there is a lot of runway to reform the multilateral system now, beginning with the SDR itself, but there are many other examples. WTO dispute resolution, a reform, of course, of the IMF itself, and the Quota. I think big power interests are misaligned, whether it is pandemic, climate, energy, let alone security management. What we have now is sort of a zero-sum calculus, or even sometimes zero-sum economic warfare. And therefore, at that point, African countries, and I don't mean just sub-Saharan Africa, I mean African countries, we have to ask ourselves a question. In the global scheme of things, we are very small economies, inherently vulnerable, over-impacted by what is happening in the global economy, in the context of an underwhelming multilateralism. The question has to be, what do we do ourselves to build the resilience? I think the continent must assume its right to exercise its agency, its right to exist, and make its own economic and social choices. We must correctly assess the current environment and develop a strategy. However, once that strategy is developed, it must be given maximum chance to succeed. Not just because it is important, but because it is existential. Not just in the short term, but in a sustainable way. I have no time to enumerate what I think the African continental free trade area could offer us, this large, seamless trade area investment space, to build that kind of resilience which we need by reducing the cost of business, attracting investment, and enabling moving up the global value chain, which you mentioned. So let me finally conclude. So terms are very tough. Growth in Africa this year would be 3.7%. That is barely above population increase, barely above population increase. Inflation is at its highest in 20 years. Africa has not been in that situation since 1972-73. Some countries are paying in debt service as much as 80% of the revenues. I know at least 2-3 cases. 80% of revenues. And there are evidence in a few countries of premature deindustrialization. If you look at, as you look at the numbers here, if you look at growth in the value added to GDP of industry, it has actually stagnated at around 20% since mid-1980s. Now, Abebe mentioned something called a demographic dividend, which means around 2040 in terms of the size of the labor force you have, which declines over time. What we should know is that, as he said it, this is not preordained. Latin America missed it. Southeast Asia got it. So, as he put it, how do we make sure this demographic dividend is actually a reality? He mentioned what we should do, which is investment in education and skills and digital. Exactly what we should do. Look, 10 to 11 million young Africans enter the labor market each year. 42 million Africans are born every year. That would be 47 in 2 years' time. It's like you add the population of Uganda to Africa's population every year, 47 million people, of whom 10 to 11 million will be young men entering and women entering the labor market. At a time when I say the value added to GDP has stagnated. So we have some work to do, not simply to stabilize our economies at the macro level, but to put in place conditions for structural transformation. And I think it is doable. It will be difficult, it's doable if you do the right things. Again, I'll go back to what happened in 1972-73. Maybe you have heard me say it. In 1972, you had this devaluation of the dollar and the end of the fixed exchange rate regime, which sent shockwaves in the financial markets worldwide. 2 years later, you had 2 oil shocks. Oil price went from $3 to, I think, $12 in the currency of those days. And that began a long period in Europe of what they call stagflation, stagnation and inflation, and like now, a search for energy security. Latin America entered a phase of debt and instability. The Middle East, a period of managing huge dollar surpluses. And Africa began the 30 years long march of negative per capita growth, which was reversed only around 2000. And so the fear now is that unless we stay the course of economic reforms and those structural changes we have to do, which he mentioned, the risk of a return of macroeconomic imbalances are quite high, But I believe we have what it takes to overcome that, as we have done over the last few years. So let me again thank Bank of Uganda, thank Mutebire family for inviting us. I think our colleague has mentioned a lot of achievements you have made. He knows more about than myself. I'm only saying that if Governor Mutebire was here, he would probably say, stay the course, be consistent. Don't be distracted by the crisis, manage them fairly, manage structural transformation, work on the multilateral order, and then keep the discipline, and success is guaranteed, as many African countries have shown. I want to thank you very much for your time and for the invitation. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, my friends.
Thank you so much, Dr. Donald Kaberuka. Friends, join me in appreciating Dr. Donald Kaberuka with another round of applause. As I invite him to take a seat on my extreme right, I now take the honor to invite Dr. Patrick Njoroge to sum up the discussions. Dr. Njoroge, you are welcome.
Thank you very much, dear guests, Mr. President, honorable ministers, Madam Betty, and distinguished guests. I came to honor a fallen colleague, a friend, my older brother. And I know the discussion was directed as to follow the variable lecture, and of course for me, following also the variable discussion by my brother, also Donald Kaberuka. But I think I want, instead of maybe I want to take a different route, if you don't mind, which is to tell you my lessons. I became the governor of the Central Bank of Kenya in June 2015. And you know, it didn't come with a manual, operational manual, how to run a central bank. So I quickly realized that there were resources I could depend on. and our fallen colleague was definitely one of them. And over the years that we worked together, I appreciated the very many conversations we had, his deep understanding of issues, his very acute political sense, and indeed, something else that I learned again and again and again, his courage. His courage. Of course, over the years, I consulted with him. You know, as central bank governors, you don't quite consult with ministers, as we have just been told, right? You consult with other governors, and you sort of find, you know, learn from their experiences, and truth be told, I really benefited from the conversations that we had. Of course, we became friends, but really, he was my older brother. And I want to thank you, Mr. President, and indeed the people of Uganda for giving me such a worthy older brother. Now, having listened to him multiple times, I have begun to see how he looked at things. So I learned from him, and I think I can sort of describe his vision, the way he explained to me various things. Frankly, as was mentioned earlier today, he can only be described as a man for all seasons. Somebody mentioned it earlier, a man for all seasons, because he didn't only play striker, he didn't only play defense, he played where he needed to play. And if he needed to be goalkeeper, he was goalkeeper. In a sense, he was a man of a lot of skills and indeed rose to the occasion as needed. Now, one of the ways I've looked at the way he looked at things is to say that he had three issues, or you could say three separate circles of issues that intersected. And I'll just mention them to you. I call them, for those in front of us, I call them the political economy trilemma. But basically, the first circle is about macroeconomic stability. And he understood very well the training that he had and understood how to maintain that. So in all the conversations, the questions, the approaches, he was a macroeconomist par excellence. And this is something that I think the younger generation need to appreciate a lot more. Meaning he was an economist, and he dealt with things as an economist. Economic growth, cost of living, all those were things that obviously, as we are told today, we struggled with, and we are struggling with them, but he could see them and discuss them and think through them as an economist. Then there's another circle, which is social stability. So he understood very well, very keen appreciation of society's pain. So for instance, when we talk about cost of living, he did understand the social side of it, meaning what it means for people and livelihoods. Purpose, when you talk about economic growth, things about equitable economic growth, etc. Various interest groups, the conversation about subsidies. Is one thing to say we should remove subsidies, another to first think about the interest groups that are there, and to then manage all that. He had a very keen sense of that. And this is all, we are discussing this with him in sort of behind doors, right? And then there's the third circle, which is what I would call opportunities. And Don, you mentioned it a moment ago. Things, for instance, about our youth. Yeah? What are we going to do about our youth? How are we presenting those opportunities to our people? because it's not enough to say there's growth. As I have famously said, we cannot eat GDP. You cannot eat GDP. At the end of the day, you need to present opportunities, and not just for the next 2-3 years, but actually sort of for the long term. Those opportunities. So jobs, sectors, agriculture, the meaning of agriculture and where is it taking us, etc. Innovation, inclusion, productivity, all those are things that are in the circle of opportunities. So if you have these 3 circles, the point is they intersect. And the issue is to hit the place where all 3 intersect. And this, to me, shows the mastery of the man, because he was able to navigate that very narrow intersection of these things without, in a sense, belaboring his, let's say, economic arguments, or for that matter, coming through like a bleeding heart, social issues, or for that matter, sort of thinking, having a very keen interest as, let's say, the Minister of Industry, et cetera, would have on industrialization, etc. So that's how I sort of place him. But in all this, I learned from him that I have to remain always a central banker. Unfortunately, I only got to know him in his later years when he was a central banker. And so the fact that he was a central banker and really wanted all of us, myself included in my conversation, to remain a central banker, but at the same time, ask the uncomfortable questions as an economist. So he appreciated my training as an economist, and obviously realized that there are benefits to asking those questions according to our training. Now, I'll mention a few things, other lessons, but I think the one lesson I would make is the first one, really. And this took time for me to appreciate. A lot of time, etc. He wasn't always very direct. Meaning he wouldn't just tell you, do this, do the other, or, even you had a conversation, and I learned a lot from that. I guess often we all want to have quick, like instant coffee answers. Just put in the instant coffee and you have the answers. So the first lesson in all this, really relating to this thing of being a central banker, is that he was very aware of his vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities also of the central bank, that's BOU. Very aware of those vulnerabilities. He didn't wear them on his sleeve, so maybe to me he would talk a little bit more. But the point is, he was very aware of those vulnerabilities, and at the same time really realized that the one card he would never throw away, is about credibility of the central bank. And he pushed that. And Don, you mentioned this thing about independence. I hate to tell you, that's a kind of an old word, Don, So the thing of credibility of the central bank. And it goes in all sorts of ways, but that is one of the things that really you could see, when you discuss with him various things that in a sense began to encroach on this independence. He would obviously react very strongly, like a lion, but at the same time understood that credibility of the central bank and independence of the central bank, if you may, was not something that was to be seen by itself. Of course, there was going to be accountability, et cetera, all that he understood. And to me, that was the first lesson, appreciation of the importance of the credibility, particularly in our economies. It's one thing to talk about credibility of a central bank like the Fed or advanced economies. You talked about G20. It's another to talk about the credibility of our central banks, given the many problems that we face. That was one thing. The second one, the second lesson, as it were, in this space, it's one thing to say that he understood, like the example that was given to us just now, about his approach to flexibility exchange rate regimes. By the way, Your Excellency, I already knew how much the governor, his views about flexible exchange rate regimes, but I only learned from you the discussion that you had about the flexibility or flexible exchange rate regimes in Uganda. And I really appreciate you are telling us that story about your conversations with Emmanuel several years ago. But I think from our perspective, it's easy to think that he could only see, or he could see the opportunities of a flexible exchange rate regime. Actually, he saw the opportunities and also the dangers. He probably wouldn't tell you what the dangers are, meaning until you're in a closed sort of space. Then he could tell me what the dangers are. And I'm sure those of you that had conversations about a particular topic, you'd see he has a very keen sense of the soft underbelly of some of the policies that we were pursuing, etc. So he understood that very well. For instance, if you remember, and I'm sure you can look at the various conversations about exchange rate, he understood the problems of excess volatility and even indiscipline by various agents, banks, foreign exchange actors, that can actually, in a sense, derail what exists as a well-functioning system, and indeed derail the economy. He fully understood that. And actually, when he was presenting various policies, at least to us and others, he understood that that is something that needed to be dealt with. And frankly, what I find a bit uncomfortable is that you had to push him a little in order for him to come through on all these things. Yeah. So once he understood you and you understood each other, then yes, of course, he would tell you all these things. Watch about this, watch that other issue. But it is important to appreciate that even with opportunities, there are dangers, and you need to watch for the dangers. Unfortunately, some of us belong to the school of just looking at the bright side of things. This is the bright side, and don't worry about the dangers. And I think that is something that I learned from him, to be very careful about to be clear about the dangers, and then to deal with them. In effect, in my view, this is a man who was playing chess. I never asked him that question, but maybe I'll ask Betty whether he actually played chess. He's the sort of person, I think, who would have done very well playing chess, because in effect, I think he played three-dimensional chess all the time. So all these three things, the problems and the opportunities, and he's talking to you about them, this to me is three-dimensional chess. And he was brilliant in that sense. And it's important for us to appreciate the sort of the mind of the man that we are obviously honoring today. I want to make two other points before I finish. There's a point about being, and we fight this all the time, short-term policies. And I think today there was a discussion about growth. And quite often we talk about 3%, 6%, 8%. The issue, though, is he who had a keen sense of the long-term outcomes. So not just the short-term, the long-term outcomes. I'll give you a simple example. The question that was raised by Abe a moment ago about inflation targeting. Actually, if you looked at any, let's say, if you go through the macro, let's say, rules, the rule book, if you may, sorry, there's no rule book, but you begin to see the preconditions. One can argue that Uganda was miles away from satisfying the precondition for inflation targeting. But in his mind, he knew that a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. And he began going in that direction before others could actually see that it was time to go in that direction. And to me, that is the amazing thing, that he had this eye for the long term. Now, when you talk about, for instance, so the long haul, when we talk to investors, quite often, this is one of the issues that we raise with them. You're investing, expecting returns in the next 2-3 years, or the next 5 years. You should be investing for the long haul. And policymakers should also be investing for the long haul. And even the government spending in health, spending in education, spending on those things, the returns are very much in the long haul. And that's where we go to these circles. So I talked about the 3 circles, opportunities are there. And those opportunities, the returns will be in the long haul. So I guess I learned this thing of look at the long haul, the returns, even as you and the people around you are also discussing the short term. So this means, for instance, building institutions, building markets, all these take time. We talked about that inflation targeting, but there are the institutions that have come up. I want to finish with the last point. The East African community. I think everybody in the room, and Your Excellency in particular, appreciate how much of a champion for the East African community our fallen brother was. But he urged us, and I can say this is something that I saw myself, not at the table, in the kitchen as it were, right? He urged us and urged our Monetary Affairs Committee, that is the Committee of Governors of Region, not to he understood the preconditions for the monetary union, etc., etc., but understood that we cannot rush ahead with monetary union and, should we say, common currency and all those other things without the preconditions being satisfied. So it meant that today now take the long haul, take the long-term view and really work. And he saw a risk of reversion to trade protectionism. So if we want to go ahead with the East African community, we need to be very concerned about this trade protectionism. And it would reverse the gains that we have had as a people of East African community, etc. So this is something that we learned from him. And I think in all the things that I think we memorialize, this is one of the ones you can say he was one of the pillars of what our East African community will be. I want to finish, Your Excellency, with a story. Years ago, I was in Arusha for a meeting of the East African community. And I happened to work with an older minister, and he told me this story. He told me this story about he had gone somewhere, that is the minister, this minister had gone somewhere, and he saw this farmer planting coconuts. Now, coconuts take a long time to grow, as we all know. And so the minister asked the farmer, hey, I see you are planting coconuts. You are old, so I don't think you'll eat from these coconuts that you are planting. So the farmer turned to the minister and said, you see, I'm planting these coconuts, and I know I will not eat from them. Others will eat from them. I, on the other hand, eat from this coconut tree here that I never planted. Our late governor planted coconuts. He probably didn't eat, and he didn't eat from those coconuts that he planted. But I, for one, have eaten from those coconuts that he planted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Njoroge. I invite you to take the front seat on my left. Distinguished guests, join me appreciate our presenter and our dear participants for the job well done. They are in front because they will take some questions later on, and I beg for music interlude as I go to the next item.
Your love is patient. You fill my heart with so much peace and joy. You're amazing. You make my life feel brand new. You're amazing.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take the opportunity to draw your attention to a feedback form that is in the folder on your desks. We ask that if you could kindly complete that, it will help evaluate today's session. All those online, if you can access the QR code, please also fill the feedback form. Thank you very much.
Jesus, you love me too much, oh. Too much, oh. Too much, oh. Excess love, oh. Jesus, you love me too much.
Your Excellency, the President, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor to invite His Excellency the President, who is our chief guest this afternoon, to address the audience.
The family of the late Mutebire, the widow and the family, Right Honorable Mbabazi, former Prime Minister, our guests, the speakers, and the governor, the deputy governor, and all the friends who are here. Mr. Mutebire was a junior part of our student group of the 1960s. We were already very active in the politics of Uganda. And we were very ambitious regarding what we wanted to be done. Now, later on, I came to learn that he had linked up with the IMF group, who had a certain way of thinking, which in our view was a limited one, but a useful one. Now, I think Mutebire also went into exile. He must have gone into exile. He must have left. I don't think he stayed here. He went to Zambia or something. Or he went out. But for us, we were in the bush fighting most of the time. Now, when we reassembled, after almost 20 years of chaos, from 1966 to 1986, that's 20 years. Now we had a chance to put in place our long-held views. So don't look at Mutebire as a freelance actor. You should look at him as part of a group who had a sub-orientation which we found useful, but it was part of the story, not the whole story. By 1962, when Uganda got independence, and these are the problems you could do, bother to understand if you want, because if you don't, you will not move. By 1962, when Uganda got independence, it was typical of the colonies and the neo-colonies. This is where the problem is. All those problems you talk about, social, this, what, they all come from that historical reality, that these countries like Uganda were colonies, and by the time of people like Idi Amin, they were neo-colonies. And these neo-colonies were characterized by what we are calling enclave economies, enclave money economies. You would have the whole economy with a small island of modernity, of money, surrounded by a sea of non-money traditional economy. By 1962, Uganda was being described as the enclave of Uganda's economy, of the money enclave, was being described as the economy of the 3 C's and the 3 T's. The 3 C's were cotton, coffee, and copper. And the 3 T's were tea, tourism, and tobacco. That was the economy of Uganda at independence, the money economy. The rest, traditional way of doing things. What we describe in our language here as abakorera ekida kyonka, people who only work for the stomach. What you call in your language subsistence economy. In law we say, teach me each keken. Now, when Idi Amin came in, he destroyed much of that small island. By 1986, cotton had collapsed, copper had collapsed. It was only coffee, which was still limping on, at 2 million bags a year. The 3 T's, tourism had collapsed, tea had shrunk from 23 million kilograms to only 3 million kilograms. And tobacco is the only one which was still limping on. So therefore, when we were assembled, we had very clear views, which had, like, if you like to record them, maybe 6 targets. And when you are talking about Uganda, that's how you should look at it. 6 targets in the economy. Number 1, the minimum recovery. To bring back, if possible, the small island of the money economy. And in order to do that, we had to deal with what Dr. Kaberuka referred to, which was reformalizing, because the economy had, that small economy had become, the whole economy had become totally informal, was no longer formal. The magendo, the smuggling, the chivanda, the foreign currency black market, the what they were calling Oksamra, speculation. That's what that economy, that residual neo-colonial economy was like that time. Now, in order to do that, definitely Mutebire and his group helped us, because they emphasized it. For them, but maybe let me first go through the targets. So the second target was after reviving the small island, then the next target was to expand it. To expand it. Revive the small island of money economy, and expand it. Number 3, diversify. Diversify the activities in the money economy. Because remember, for instance, if you, those three C's and 3 T's, were being told that these were cash products. Coffee was a cash crop. Cotton was a cash crop. But maize was not a cash crop. It was a food. So for the urban people who sometimes eat maize flour, akawunga, they are to buy it from Kenya. The Kenyan whites who are growing that maize. So in Uganda, maize was not a cash crop. Milk was not a cash crop. Milk was just a food. When you came to the town, you would find powdered milk from Denmark, condensed milk from New Zealand. In Ntungamo there, in my home village, you'd go into the Indian shops and you find there small tins of condensed milk from Switzerland, from New Zealand, and so on. And here we had cows, but we had no linkage with the market. Bananas were not a cash crop. Sugar cane was just for chewing. Just chew and you spit on the road. The fruits were not a cash crop. So therefore, our third target, first of all, restore the island. Secondly, expand the island. And number 3, diversify the activities in the island. Then number 4, start building a new economy of a new type. Because as you are doing all that, you are reviving education, you are reviving infrastructure, and so on. Then start building an economy of a new type. By, for instance, reviving our educational system and introducing new faculties, which was part of our long-term plan. Like, for instance, at Makerere, there was no food science faculty. We introduced it deliberately because Uganda easily produces those agricultural products. Now, that new faculty which we introduced, and another department which we introduced was the Faculty of Quantitative Economics, or department. I think it is in the economics department. That food science faculty has produced a lot of new innovators who are now creating a new economy for us, not the other one of the traditional cash crops, like the banana project by Dr. Muranga, like all sorts of new food items, processed, but from our traditional crops. So the Faculty of Engineering has been able to produce people who have made for us the electric vehicles, electric buses, electric cars. The electric car we are developing now is what we call the Chira vehicle, electric vehicle, which is, Chira is the name of the Nile. That's what we call Nile. Nile is called Chira. That's why the president of South Sudan is called Salva Kiir. Kiir in their language is the same like here. We call it Kira here. For them, they call it Kiir. So this automobile industry, which we are developing, the pathogenic, Dr. Kaberuka was talking about how Africans had to die democratically until they were saved by somebody. Well, it's good, but then people wake up from those experiences. So we are busy developing our vaccines, developing our pharmaceutical industry. So that is the fourth effort, economy based on human intellect and science, not just the other traditional. Then number 5, massive, broad-based value addition. Because part of the problem, if you look at the economies of the third world, especially Africa and Latin America, as somebody was saying, you take, for instance, coffee. The global value of coffee today is $460 billion. 460 billion. Out of that, all the coffee-growing countries, all of them, their share is only $27 billion. And Africa's share is 2.5 billion. So you tell me, how can you develop? You produce a product, you get, because for us, when we produce a kilo of coffee here, we get $2 for a kilo of coffee. Somebody roasts it and grinds it and packs it, and he gets $50. And we have got economists and analysts and all these people. What are they analyzing? Why don't they see this? So, you must have heard that I belong to a group called National Resistance Movement. You must have heard that rumor, that this old man belongs to something called National Resistance Movement. So we resist this bankruptcy that we produce and we get not even 1% of the value of our products. This is madness. So we started with the struggle. I started with the struggle because I'm a cattle keeper. If you have never seen cattle keepers, there's one of them here. As soon as of course I had started when I was a student, trying to wake up those cattle pharaohs who were running up and down with nomadism. In the 1960s, we tried to settle them down and all that. But when we came from the bush, I went and really engaged them very intensely to turn milk into a cash crop, first of all, because milk was not a cash crop. milk was a food. The cash milk was from Denmark. They would go to Denmark, get powdered milk, bring it here, add water of Lake Victoria, and print there Uganda Dairy Corporation. The dairy there was the water, the Ugandan. You can't believe the lack of seriousness. So we mobilized those pharaohs in the cattle corridor, convince them that they can produce the milk, feed the towns here. You should be the ones to produce milk to feed the towns. Because they had cows but no money. Why no money? Because they were not selling what they were producing. So we were able to convince them. They started selling the milk. The government dairy corporation was too small. It was processing 65,000 liters a day. Production was going up. We got private investors from India, from where. Now we have got a huge dairy industry, fully integrated from production to liquid milk, to powdered milk, to ghee, to butter, to all those things. Even sub-products. There's a product called casein, a protein which they use in food formulations, which the U.S. import. These pharaohs are producing it here. So that was the front line on milk. We are engaged on the front line in bananas, to add value to the bananas. We are engaged in the front line of the coffee. Coffee, big war. To add value to the coffee. Big war. I met, many years ago, I met Nescafe. And is it Nescafe, one of those groups? Nescafe is the other one. There are two of them. They took us to a very cold place called Davos. I don't know why they take people there. I think it is good for them to shiver there. Then I met these pharaohs there. You pharaohs, why don't you come in Uganda and add value to our coffee? They said, very sorry, Mr. Museveni. We already have a factory in London. This is the one that is producing for the whole world. If you want, you have to, we cannot help you. They told me off. But we have not given up. We are moving. We are going, we shall add value to our coffee, and we shall get out of that slavery. And cassava, all that line of adding value. Then finally, another front line we had to struggle with is because by 1969, you can see how dangerous some of these African countries, especially those which are well endowed with resources like Uganda, because Uganda has got everything. That's why many of the Ugandans are lazy. It is not easy to die here. Even if you don't work, you go and stay with your brother. Why have you come? I have come to see you. Which I could have. Who told you that I needed to be viewed as a film? They're just there, having an easy life. The more some of these countries which have got a lot of resources, like Uganda, like Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, you don't have to work in Congo. You just eat mangoes and forest products and some monkeys. You don't have to. So it's very dangerous if you don't get leaders to wake up these people. It's quite a problem. So here, you can check the figures. I tried to check. By 1969 census, We had a census in 1969. We had one in 1959, just before independence. Then we had one in 1969. I think if I remember the figures, only 4% of the people were in the money economy. 96% were in the subsistence economy. So imagine, only 4%. When we came into government, we started talking about it. But when we checked, even by 2013, the people who were in the money economy were now 32% of the homesteads. 68% were outside the money economy. So our sixth point is the struggle for the universal monetization of the whole society, so that we end the abakorera echida chonka, the people who only work for the stomach. Now, this is our plan from the very beginning. Now, when we came and we linked up with the Mutebires, definitely they contributed. And in particular, Mutebire contributed, I think, 6 points. I was trying to remember. Number one, emphasis on the private sector, the role of the private sector. I think there were that group of Mutebire, Kasami, Muhakanizi, and a few others. We are not very, very insisting on the private sector. I would even say committing the sin of idolatry, worshipping idols. They were worshipping the private sector because sometimes they had a war, you know, because I was like an umpire. On one side was Mutebire and that group, and on the other side was Dr. Suruma. You know Suruma? Is he here? Oh, they should stand up and they see you if they know who you are. Now, I was the umpire because I would listen to their arguments and then finally decide to go with this one or the other one. Now, most of the time, I went with the Mutebire group, and I will tell you why. But there is one debate where there was Mutebire and his group on one side, and Dr. Solomon on the other side. I went with the Mutebires, but later on I regretted. I should have gone with. This was the UCB, the privatization of the UCB. Because Uganda Commercial Bank was doing very well. It was making a profit. But the Mutebire group put out an argument that the interest rates are high because you are talking about interest rates. This was the debate we had. The interest rates are high because UCB is a government company, and the managers are carelessly giving loans, and many of the loans are not paid back, and we who are stupid to pay back end up paying for ourselves and paying for the ones who didn't pay. That's why what they were calling loan recovery. Loan recovery was very low because the government bankers were careless. If it was private, that would not happen. So but Dr. Surumak put up a very big fight. But I said no. I got sort of persuaded by the Mutebire. I said, let's try it and see. And we called the South Africans here, this group called Stambik. They came, hakuna kita watu. The interest rates are nothing. They have done nothing. So next time, then there were other government banks, UDB, Housing Finance, I don't know, there's another one called Posta Bank. They said, we want to privatize. I said, please forget. We will never, no more privatization of these banks. Because I made a mistake of UCB, I will never repeat it again. And it is the UDB, we are now using to do something, to deal with that problem, which somebody was talking about it. I think it was the Ethiopian who was talking about the low level of private sector lending. We are using the UDB to solve that. But where definitely the Mutebire has helped us was area number one was controlling inflation. That one definitely they helped us. Because when I would listen, when I would sit in these meetings, they would be having arguments with other economists. There was Dr. Nahemia. Nahemia was in the NRM Secretariat. There were people who were having different ideas. But when they would argue, I would sit there and listen. Like, for instance, the controlling inflation, I even remember my own old economics, that money is the store of value. One of the values of money is the store of value. Now, if you store value and it is losing value every time, every year, it is coming weaker, then how would that economy be attractive? So I got converted and I really supported, I went with them on that issue of the inflation. Then there was the issue of the exchange rate, allowing the exchange rate to find its own level. Oh, big battle. People arguing this, arguing that. But when I listened carefully, I thought the Mutebires were correct, because why do you undersell the dollars? If the dollars are worth so much on the black market, then that is their value. So in other words, we transfer the black market from the black market to the banks and the forex bureaus, and it helped the economy. It brought discipline. Then Mutebire advised me on the issue of uniting the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Planning. You remember they used to be separate. There would be Minister of Planning, and some people were arguing that that was good, but Mutebire was able to show me that no, that's not good, because why do you plan when you don't know how much money you have? Why does the one who is having money be the one to plan? Because he knows how much money he has. So again, there are already civil wars in these offices. This one saying this, this one saying that. So I went with the Mutebire group there. Then resistance against economic cheap popularity. For instance, minimum wage. That issue of the minimum wage. The person who warned me against that minimum wage, which was being pushed by the labor unions, by the what, by this group, Mutebire was, they said, look here, people don't have enough jobs. The few who have got jobs, you come and you tell the employers that they must pay so much. What if they can't afford? What will happen? Why don't you concentrate on creating more jobs first? And then the scarcity of jobs is the one which will raise the value of labor. So up to now, we have never agreed on the issue of the minimum wage. And this was a contribution by the Mutebire group. Then there was the issue of health insurance, the health insurance scheme. That one again was also being pushed by some groups. But then when we consulted, because the health insurance groups involves the employer contributing also. Does it not involve that? The employer must also contribute. Is that so or not so? The employer must contribute. So the employer is already contributing for NSSF. You remember this, the NSSF. The employer is still contributing for NSSF. Then you add these other costs. And then you have not dealt with the issue of the cost of transport. Because remember one of the people, I think it was our Ethiopian friend, who talked about Uganda being landlocked. Transport costs are still very high. Electricity costs are still high. Now you add also the cost of all these social programs, NSSF, insurance. How will the employers manage? So we said, okay, it's a good idea, but hold on. So definitely, the Mutebire group helped us with those tactics of implementing our long-term program. But where I needed to caution you, the IMF group, is I pointed out to Mutebire, you are talking of the private sector-led growth. That if you maintain macroeconomic stability, then the private sector will be encouraged to invest, and you will get growth. Yes, some of the people in the towns may respond positively. But Mr. Kaguta, my father, is he part of the private sector? Because I told Mutebire, Mr. Kaguta is not part of the private sector. He's part of the traditional sector, the pre-money system of Africa. People who just grow food and eat it. The people who are talked about by Adam Smith in his book of 1776. Somebody who grows his own food, builds his own house. If you go to some parts of Uganda, you'll find people who are building their own houses. They don't hire people to build houses for them. They carry their own water from the well. They don't have to pay this group of NSA, what do you call it, national water. They look for their own firewood. They are self-sufficient at a pre-capitalist level. And we are telling you that these were 96% in 1969, and even as recently as 2013, they were still 68% of the population. So how do you get these people from the pre-money system to the system of money? I found the IMF group really deficient in that. So that's why we had now to use political mobilization. I don't know what you would call them in your language. Would you call them socio-economic reforms, where you go out deliberately to persuade these people to come in the money economy. That's why in 2013, having tried many things, I tried Minister of Agriculture, they didn't do anything. I tried, there was Ntandikwa, Minister of Finance, they didn't do anything. So 2013, I had to involve the UPDA, the army. We created a group called Operation Wealth Creation by the soldiers. And these are the people who went out under our command to persuade people to join the money economy. Take free seedlings of coffee, take free gifts of this. And you have seen what has happened. I hear now, because of that intervention of 2013, for the first time, the people in the money economy in Uganda are now 61%, while the people who are still in the non-money economy are 39%. They are still there, asleep, not bothered. We are struggling with them. Now we have started this PDM, Parish Development Model. We shall see what will happen. So therefore, there, I found the IMF group really having some issue. Of course, Uganda is not typical. Some of the other countries had different experiences. They were, in the colonial times, there were mining and so on, mining economies, plantation economies. But a country like Uganda, maybe some of the other countries, you need to do more than using the macroeconomic tools to make people wake up and become part of the money economy. So therefore, Mr. Mutebire, and he had his group of Kasami, Mahakarizi. There are others, I think, who are still in the ministry. They definitely contributed to our plan. Because remember, from the very beginning, our 10 points program, point number 5 was building an economy that is independent, integrated, and self-sustaining. Now, people thought we were just talking a slogan. But you have seen how we have survived all these, like this crisis which came when people were saying, we are going to die. Why? Why are you going to die? Because there is war in Ukraine and Russia. And there will be no wheat. Yeah, no wheat. Why don't you eat mogo? Why are you eating wheat? Oh, so now you tell me who has died because of not eating wheat. I want you to show me one person. We built up a lot of capacity in terms of food, in terms of now, the commentators were right. There are definitely clear weaknesses. Number one is corruption. Corruption is not an economic issue, it is just corruption. What the speakers were talking about, the low tax GDP ratio of 13%, what 14%, is really due to the corruption in the Ministry of Finance and in the URA, although we have changed, but there is a problem there. I've told them many times, and I have quite enough evidence to show them that there is a lot of under-collection of tax. In the IMF person was correct. All these new buildings, which are real estate, there's a lot of under-collection of revenue, which is the corruption in the Ministry of Finance. And some of those people who were under Mutebire were not as clean as Mutebire was. They were there doing bad things. But we are struggling with them. There's a lot of under-collection in the telephone companies. They are under-declaring. They make many telephone calls, very few are declared. And there's a big war going on there, how to detect. Now, Dr. Kaberuka But one of the reasons which did not come in your analysis, one of the reasons why there was deceleration in the growth of the economy of Uganda was at one time we had shortage of electricity. From 2005, because democracy, parliament, wanted to build new dams. One of them was Ujagari. I negotiated with there was an American group which I had met with the Christian groups in USA called American Energy something. We agreed on how to build Ujagari. Then when it went to parliament, it was stopped democratically, parliament, democracy. So we lost time. And by the time by 2005, we started load shedding. That, you should assess how much that derailed us. Now we have caught up, we have got a bit more electricity now. New dams, Bujagari was eventually built, but more expensively. We have built these other new ones, Isimba, Karuma, the other smaller ones. But we lost time there. And I don't know how it impacted. They can check how it impacted the rate of growth. But it will pick up. It will pick up. Recently we had this problem of corona. It will pick up. The real war now we are having is corruption. Corruption is the real war because they delay investors, they do this, they do that. Now, finally, the CFTA, which Dr. Kaberuka talked about, that's a real I totally agree with Dr. Kaberuka. Stop looking at this sub-Saharan Africa because there's no logic in that. Because actually there is more complementarity between sub-Sahara and North Africa. Because North Africa needs what we have. We have what they don't have. We have crops, we have agricultural products, we have all sorts of things which they don't have. So there should be more complementarity. It should be planning for the whole of Africa and even the Middle East. We are relating very well now with the UAE. They come here, they find that they need a lot of things from here which they don't have. So I totally agree that the CFTA should be emphasized more. So, therefore, in conclusion, Mutebire was definitely very useful ally, a very useful member of the resistance movement, because he was part of the resistance movement. From the student days, he was with the Mbabazis together. They were the same group, with the Rugundas. He was not so much involved in the political organization, but he was a friendly force on the side of the economy. Now, when we came, he definitely helped us on to summarize where he himself and his group, but led by him, where they helped us was number one, emphasis on the private sector. Because in many cases it worked well. This was a government hotel called Nair Hotel. Now it's a private hotel. And it's running well. And whatever problems it has are no longer government headaches. And when we liberalized the hotel sector, because there was a government company called Uganda Hotels, which had this hotel here, had what they call Sheraton, had others up country. It was like blocking people. These government hotels were like blocking people coming into the hotel sector. Now, when we walked out, we liberalized it. If you go up country, there are so many hotels now. You go to Gulu, there used to be only Gulu Inn, which was a government hotel, but here now there are so many hotels there in Gulu. You go to Mbale. Mbale, there was only, was it called Mbale what? Something. Now there are so many hotels there. The government one is no longer even known. Soroti. This one here, this Ginger, Crested Crane. There are so many hotels there. Transport. Do you know that the government was also in transport? Buses. Government-owned buses. UTC and something they called people's buses. When we got out, there are so many buses that your head will go dizzy if you try to count them. Companies. Then you go to so many. By walking out of some of these areas, like the export of coffee. You know, the export of coffee was a monopoly of the government. We had something called Coffee Marketing Board. When we moved out, so many companies came in. We need to control them now that we want to add value to our coffee. They are they are part of the resistance. I told them that they are slave traders. Slave traders were also resisting the abolition of slavery. So we shall sort it out. But many people, many players came in the coffee. For sure.
Smart 24, driving business.